Hi everyone, I'm a PhD student at CQT in Professor Quek's group. And in this lecture, I'll be covering the prerequisites for quantum mechanics. So that would consist of complex numbers and linear algebra. And these would be very useful for the subsequent lectures. It's important that you get this stuff, you understand this stuff before moving to the lecture. So please stop me, interrupt me during the lecture if you have any doubt, because that would be easier to explain as we go along. Okay, so let's start with the part one, which will be on complex numbers. Okay, so what is the motivation to study complex numbers? So the first motivation, you can say, like, and keeping the physics context in mind, the first motivation is to simplify the notations and calculations in certain topics. For example, electromagnetic waves. When we study EM waves, it's easier to represent different components of the EM field using complex numbers, and then that simplifies the notations, and then the calculations also easier because instead of using like trigonometric identities for these cos and sine functions, it's easier to work with exponentials. So that's like one motivation, but for our purpose mostly we'll be concerned with quantum mechanics, and there complex numbers have a more fundamental role because complex numbers are like kind of ingrained into the postulates of QM, short for quantum mechanics. So why they are ingrained into the postulates, for that you would have to wait till the part 2 of math lectures, which would be on linear algebra. But yes, keep these things in mind. So with that, we start with defining complex numbers. So complex number is Z is any number which has both a real part and a complex part or an imaginary part. So here X is the real part and Y is the imaginary part, which is with the coefficient I. So what is this I? I is the square root of -1. Now coming like in a high school, if you have never seen complex numbers before, this wouldn't make sense because negative square root of a negative number does not make sense. But let's say for the moment define it as some quantity I, like, some symbol I which just represents -1, square root of -1, and then we work with that. So okay, so we have defined complex numbers, Z, which will have a which in general, which you can write as x plus I times y, where x is the real part and y is the imaginary part. Okay, and then for example, in a complex number Z, if x equal to 0, then we say that Z is purely imaginary because the real part is 0. And then if y is equal to 0 here, then we say that x is Z is purely real because the imaginary part is 0. So yeah, other thing to note is that the real part and the imaginary part both are actually real and belong to this the set of real numbers, and this set of real numbers is the familiar set between -infinity to infinity. So yeah, so let's see an example. Let's say there is a complex number 1 plus 2i. So in this example, x for z1 is 1 and y for z1 is 2. Similarly, you can have a purely imaginary number. Let's say z2, which you can call -I. So it's purely imaginary because the real part is 0. And then for this, y for z2 is -1. So keep in mind that x and y, or the real and imaginary parts, should always be real or should belong to real numbers. Okay. Okay, moving on. So now we see Argand diagrams. So what are Argand diagrams? They are a geometrical representation of the set of all complex numbers. And then they are helpful in visualizing complex numbers on on a plane, because every complex number has two components, real and imaginary. So it's good if you have a visual depiction of the complex numbers. So let's take an example. Yeah, so before taking the example, look at this Argand diagram, the plot that we have in pink. In this diagram, on the x-axis, we have the real part of z, and on the y-axis, we have the imaginary part of z. So for this example, let's say 1 plus I, z1 equal to 1 plus I. The real part is 1. So we'll plot, you'll have a line uh, on the real line 1, and the imaginary part is also 1. So we have another line on the imaginary axis, and where they both intersect, this is our point 1 comma 1. So this point on the complex plane, on the Argand plane, this represents our complex number z1. And then now that we're talking about this Argand diagram, it is also useful to think of every complex number as a position vector with one end on the origin and the other end at the tip of the z1. So for example, look at this. Our complex number z1 is also represented by a position vector from point A, which is the origin, to this point representing z1. Okay. Similarly, let's look at another example. So this new point in orange it represents the complex number 2 plus 3i, because it's intersects, like if you drop a perpendicular on the real axis, then it intersects at 2, and on the imaginary axis, it intersects at 3. And then the position vector representing z2 would be this vector AB. Now the position, I'm hoping that you guys are familiar with position vectors, in the Cartesian or in the usual Cartesian plane, or in the usual 2D geometry. But if not, then it would be helpful if I know about it, because I'll be using this later on. So I'm assuming that you guys understand this concept of position vector. So if there's no doubt, then I'll continue. So yeah, we have looked at some examples for the Argand diagram. Okay. Now we move to complex number arithmetic. So remember that we started by defining complex numbers as any number which will have a real part and a complex and an imaginary part. So how do we define the sum of two complex numbers z and w? So we'll define it in the following way. Let's say z is our a plus bi and w is our c plus di. So the real parts are a and c respectively, and the imaginary parts are b and d respectively. So we will just add them component wise, or let's say part this real part to real part and imaginary part to imaginary part, and hence we obtain z plus w as this. A plus c is the real part of z plus w, and b plus d is the imaginary part of z plus w. So this is the rule for obtaining sum. And similarly, we can also define the product of two complex numbers z and w, again represented by a plus bi and c plus di. So and here we'll just we'll do it like component wise, as in the real part a will be multiplied to both c and d, and again the imaginary part will also be multiplied to both c and d. But keep in mind that when bi when bi is being multiplied with di, then we'll get bdi square, and since I was the square root of -1, I square will be -1. And following this rule, the product that we'll get of Z and W is as shown. So where the real part, new real part of the product is AC minus BD, and the imaginary part of the product is AD plus BC. So this is simple. Okay. Now on the Argand diagram, what happens if we take the sum? Let's see. So let's say there is this complex number Z1 and there's another complex number Z2. Now, since we defined these Z1 and Z2 on the Argand plane as position vectors, they should follow the parallelogram law of vector addition. So the sum, the rule that we have defined for sum should also obey that parallelogram law on this Argand diagram. So see that what will happen to the sum of Z1 and Z2. So here we have so the resultant that we get here after adding Z1 and Z2 is the same as what we would have obtained if we had followed the parallelogram law, which is this new vector Z3. So what we did was that we parallelly moved this vector Z1 to this vector here, and then using this triangle law of addition, we got this new vector Z3, and you will see that the components of Z3 will follow the rule that we had defined earlier. Okay. Now look at some properties of complex numbers. So for the first property that we will look at is the complex conjugate. So the complex conjugate is like very simple. If let's say there is a complex number Z, which is written as x plus iy, then the complex conjugate is just you invert the mathematical sign or the sign in front of the imaginary part. So the Z star is the symbol for complex conjugate, or a representation for complex conjugate is nothing but x plus iy. Oh, sorry, x minus iy. So we inverted the sign of y. So for example, if z1 is 1 plus I, then z1 star is 1 minus I. And what happens to a vector on conjugating, if you conjugate it on the Argand plane, then that's also very easy to see that it is just reflected in the real axis. So let's say this is 2 plus 3i, some complex number represented by this position vector 2 plus 3i. Then the conjugate complex conjugate is 2 minus 3i, and on the Argand plane that is just the reflection in this real axis. Yeah, so it's not drawn to scale, but it's just a reflection. Okay. Okay. The second property that we will look at is the modulus of complex number z. So again, our z is x plus iy. Then we denote the modulus by this two vertical bars around z, and the value of that z. And remember that this mod of z belongs to the set of real numbers. So it has to give you some positive real number, and it is just the square root of x square plus y square. And then it has the one interesting, like interpretation on the Argand plane. So let's say that there is some, so there is this complex number, let's say there's this complex number 3 plus 4i, then on the Argand plane, it will be somewhere here. And the mod of z1 is root of 9 plus 16, so that is 5. And on the what that represents on the Argand plane is actually the length of the position vector representing this z1. So the mod of z1 is actually this length from the origin to this point z1. So this has a very nice representation on the Argand plane. Okay. Okay. Now look, there are more exercises in the lecture notes that you all should try, but just for the moment, for as an example, I'll just go through these two. So the first is z, you have to show that z star is equal to the sum of so square of the mod. So let's say if z is x plus iy, then our z star is x minus iy, and then we know the product rule for two complex numbers. So we'll use that to calculate this. So these two terms cancel. And we are left with, and I square, remember that I square is minus 1. So we are left with x square plus y square. And then we defined our mod of z as the square root of x square plus y square. So this is just the square of the mod. The second exercise is there a question? Okay. So the second exercise that I'll work out is we have to show that the mod of z plus w is always less than equal to the individual mods of z and w. So the mod of the sum is less than the sum of the mods. So for that, we'll take the help of the Argand plane, because we know that the mod has a good, good interpretation in the Argand plane. So let's say there are like any two random points, z and w. Let's represent that using orange. Then the length w is actually this length, or the mod of w is actually this length of the position vector from origin to point w. And the length z, or the mod of z, is this length. Now, as we saw earlier, that the sum z plus w can be obtained using the parallelogram law of addition. So, let's assume that these are parallel. So this new point that we get after moving parallelly moving this vector z to the tip of w is z plus w. And the length, so let's just again mark the lengths of all sides. So this point is B, this point is C, and this point is A. So see that in the triangle ABC, one side has the length W or mod of W, one side has the length mod of Z, and the third side has the length mod of Z plus W. Okay. And for any triangle, in this triangle ABC, we know that the sum of two sides is always greater than or equal to the third side. So, the length of, let's say, by L of AB, I represent the length of AB. So the length of AB plus length of BC has to be greater than or equal to the length of AC, because this is a triangle. And then from this we have our required proposition that the mod of W plus mod of Z is greater than or equal to the mod of Z plus W. Okay, which is what we wanted to show. Okay, so yeah, this is just an example of how the geometrical representation can be useful for simplifying some exercises. Okay, okay, this is another example, and it's a very simple example. What we have to do is, given this complex number which has like a numerator and denominator, we have to simplify this in our usual form, like which is the a plus bi. So we have to find what in a and b would be. So what this is a very common trick used for complex numbers, that we always try to create a real number in the denominator, so that all the i's, so that we can separate the factors for I and the part without the I. And for that, what we do is this: we multiply the numerator and the denominator by the complex conjugate of the denominator, because we know that z star is going to give us a real number. So this will give us 2 plus in the numerator, and then denominator it will be just 2. So this gives us minus 1 over 2 plus 5 over 2 I. So our A is minus half and our B is 2.5. And there's a similar example in the lecture notes that you all should try. Okay, this is simple. Okay. Next, we move to the polar representation of complex numbers, and this is also very useful, especially in physics. Or especially in electromagnetism, where the polar representation is what that is used often, because it's more tedious to write every complex number as x plus iy. So what is the polar representation? It is just we write z as equal to r times exponential to the power I theta, or e to the power I theta, where e is the is the that natural log constant 2.7 something. And for the moment, you can just assume that this is true, that for every complex number you can write it as r times e to the power I theta, where r is a real number, positive real number, which is equal to square root of x square plus y square. So you would see that this is just the mod of z, so it has to be a positive real number, and this theta in the exponent of e is tan inverse y over x. And it's again, it's better to understand what what it represents in the Argand plane. So let's say there's this point z x plus iy. Then we already know that mod of z is going to be what, or r is going to be equal to mod of z is going to be the length from origin to this point z, and theta is what? So this length is y, because it is the imaginary part, and this length is x because it's the real part. So tan theta, this implies that tan theta is equal to y over x. So tan theta is going to be y over x. So in this diagram, we know that this is going to be theta. So for any complex number z, written in the polar form, r is the distance of the point from the origin, and theta is the angle or the counterclockwise angle from the real axis till the position vector representing z. So this is z. So this is theta, and we go like counterclockwise from the real axis. Okay. Now, relating to the polar form, there is a very useful formula, and the proof is probably given in the lecture notes, but for the moment, I'll state it without proof. And that formula is Euler's formula, which basically actually says that e to the power I theta can be written as cos theta plus I times sine theta. So this r just cancels, so it is the same thing that I've written here. So, and this is a very kind of a very the first time I saw this formula, I was very fascinated by it, because it says something very weird, that you take this natural log constant e and you raise it to the power I theta, where I is itself like square root of -1, and that gives you a trigonometric function like cos theta plus I times sine theta. But it is very useful, and with more and more use, you will get used to it. You like, the more you see it, you will get used to it. But yeah, every time I think about it, it looks very fascinating. And then there's just one example, or one kind of exercise that I've worked out here. And what I'm trying to show here is that the product formula that we defined earlier, how it relates to the product of two exponentials. So if you recall the law for multiplying two exponentials, let's say there's some number, for some number, or let's take the natural log constant e to the power a, and you multiply it with some other number e to the power b, then it gives you e to the power a plus b. So the exponents just add up on multiplication. So similarly, this should be true in the case of complex numbers as well. So let's say there is a complex number z1, which is r1, which has this polar form r1 e to the power I theta 1, and another complex number z2, which has the polar form r2 e to the power I theta 2. Then the product is given by this, where we see that the exponents just add up. And uh, here is an exercise that shows that the product rule that we defined earlier in the second or third slide, that actually agrees with the product rule of the exponents. So there is no contradiction. Very important. So I'll just briefly walk you through this calculation. It's very simple. I mean, maybe you should try this yourself after the lecture. That a plus ib is our z1 and c plus id is our z2. Then this is the product rule that we defined earlier. And if we also write z1 in the polar form, then a would be r1 cos theta 1 using Euler's formula. Because see that a plus ib is r1 times e I theta 1, and then using Euler's formula, it is also r1 cos theta 1 plus I times R1 sine theta 1. So A is equal to our R1 cos theta 1 and B is equal to R1 sine theta 1. And similarly, C is equal to our R2 cos theta 2 and D is R2 sine theta 2. Okay. Yeah, so it's already half an hour over. So I'll just very quickly go through this. And this is like the last slide, yeah, for complex numbers. So you should just work this out yourself, to get a better understanding. But if you just calculate this AC minus BD expression and BC plus AD expression using these using these expressions for AB and CD, then you see that in the end you do get Z1 and Z2 as equal to the R1 and R2 times e to the power I theta 1 plus theta 2. And another exercise for you is to show that e to the power I pi plus 1 is equal to 0. So, for this is just a simple application of the Euler's formula where you will just use cos pi plus I sin pi. E to the power I pi would be this, and then you will see that. Okay, pretty much I have done this, but cos pi is -1 and sin pi is 0. So this is just -1 and -1 plus 1 is 0. So this is just a simple, plugging in the values. Okay. Now let's move to the part 2. And before I move to part 2, are there any questions for in complex numbers? Okay, if not, then let's move to linear algebra. So again, let's look at the motivation. So in this lecture, we are mostly concerned with the prerequisites for studying QM. So for complex numbers, I said that complex numbers are kind of inbuilt into the postulates of QM. Now the postulates of QM, they deal with this wave function of a system. So mostly the most of quantum mechanics is about finding this wave function psi. And you'll learn more about this psi in the coming lectures about Schrodinger equation, and tomorrow and the day after that. But yeah, keep in mind that this wave function psi is the primary target of all what we are doing. So in the mathematical formalism that was mostly devised by David Hilbert and Johnny von Neumann in the 1950s, around that time, they treated this wave function psi as a vector in the complex vector space. So see, if our vector space itself is complex, then we need, that's kind of inbuilt that we need to know what complex numbers are. And what is meant by a vector space? So vector space is, like any the set of all vectors that follow a certain rules. And the major, or the pretty much the only rule that we are concerned with is that the linear combination of vectors of any vector in the vector space, or of any set of vectors from the vector space, should give another vector in the same complex vector space. So let's say there is vector A, B, C, which you take, or these can be any vectors in the vector space, and you try to come up with a linear combination. So what is a linear combination? You just some scalar C1 times A plus another scalar C2 times B plus another scalar C3 times C. Then this sum will also give you a vector in the complex vector space. So that's the only rule that we are concerned with. And the complex vector space that we deal with in quantum mechanics is called the Hilbert space, because I think Hilbert was the first to give rules for for this wave function phi xi. So apart from the usual rules of vector space, there's another rule that the norm should be 1. So yeah, all these things will become more clear in the subsequent slides. So yeah, so this is like mostly the motivation that why we are studying linear algebra. And the last thing to note is that in this set of lectures, and also the coming lectures tomorrow and day after that, we will only work with the Dirac notation of vectors. And the Dirac notation, we will be using Dirac notation because it's pretty much prevalent in all the quantum mechanics literature. Like the standard literature for linear algebra for the math, like math books and all that, they would not use the Dirac notation, but introducing Dirac notation earlier is always useful. So what's the Dirac notation? So in the Dirac notation, we write any vector v as this ket v. So the ket is just this symbol, like anything in between this vertical bar and this right arrow, or this curly brace, is ket, and we represent our vectors v using this ket v, or we call them ket v. Okay. So take for example, yeah, again, the other thing to note here is that we are representing our vectors using a column of numbers. But note that these vectors v are not equal to the column of vectors, a column of numbers, v1 and v2. So yeah, other thing to note here is that this v1 and v2 belong to the set of complex numbers. So these are like the elements of our column, and each element is a complex number. And since there are two elements for this example v, we say that this ket v belongs to C2, because each element of this two element vector belongs to C. If a vector w, let's call some other vector ket w, has n components, then we will say that our ket w belongs to Cn. So this is just a representation saying that each element can belong to a set of complex numbers. Next, we look at vector arithmetic. So let's say that there is this vector ket v, which has a representation. So you also note that everywhere I'll be using this symbol for the representation, which is the hat, a hat on top of the equal to sign, which is just which emphasizes that we are using the column as a representation and not equality. And this will become more as we see the concept of basis later. So for the vector ket v with this representation and the ket w with this representation, the sum is just the addition component wise. So each of ket v and w belong to C3. So they have three components. So the sum will also have three components, and we just add them component wise. So v1 plus w1, v2 plus w2, and v3 plus w3. So this is the new column representing our v plus w. Similarly, we can define a scalar multiplication. So the multiplication of a vector with some scalar c. So this scalar c also belongs to complex numbers, and each element of the vector ket v also belongs to complex numbers. So the scalar multiplication is defined as shown, that we will just multiply each element by this scalar c. So c times v1 and c times v2. So this is the new, this is the column representing our c times v, c times ket v. Okay, let's look at more examples. Let's say there is this ket v, given by this column, and this ket w given by this column. So what will be the sum? It is just 2 plus 3i minus 2i. So we are adding component wise, and minus 2 plus 1 plus 2i. Okay. Similarly, let's look at another example. Ket v plus I times ket w. So recall the rule for scalar multiplication. So I times 0 is 0, and I times 1 is I. And this just gives us 1 plus. So this is the new column, or this is the column representing our ket v plus I times ket w. Okay. Now there is a remark or a note that we cannot multiply a ket v with ket w because it doesn't make sense. You can multiply a ket v with a scalar, but so note that this ket v is going to be a column, n cross 1 column, and then ket w is going to be another n cross 1 column. And according to the rules of matrix multiplication, or any, yeah, like using the usual rules, there is no way to multiply n cross 1 column with another n cross 1 column. You can multiply n cross 1 column with 1 cross n row, as we will see next. But two columns cannot be multiplied. Okay. So first, let's look at the conjugate transpose of a vector. So let's say there is a ket v which has this representation, v1 and v2 of column of v1 and v2. Then the conjugate transpose is just a row, so from the column it becomes a row, and we take the complex conjugate of each element. So recall that if z is the complex number x plus iy, then z star is x minus iy. So similarly, and we call this conjugate transpose as the bra v. So the column was ket v, and this is the transpose of that is bra v, and we represent that again. There's a representation symbol by this row of v1 star and v2 star. So let's look at an example. If ket v is as shown, the column of 2 plus 3i and I, then the bra v would be a row of 2 plus 3i complex conjugate and I complex conjugate. So this is just 2 minus 3i and minus I. So we just invert the sign of the imaginary part. Okay. Next, let's look at the inner product. So inner product of two vectors. So yeah, so note that we said that we cannot multiply two vectors, but still we can obtain the inner product of two vectors, and that is because the inner product is defined like this. So in a way, this just what this is saying is that we multiply the bra v with the ket w, and the bra v we know that it is a row now after taking the conjugate transpose. So a row of v1 star and v2 star. So now we can multiply this with the ket w. So also note that this inner product is now a number or a scalar, and it's no longer another column. So this operation of calculating the inner product of two vectors gives us a scalar, and similarly this could have had n components. So we would have this v1 star, v2 star up till vn star, and we would similarly do the element wise multiplication, v1 star w1 plus v2 star w2 plus v3 star w3 up till vn star wn. And why could we do this? Because here we are multiplying this 1 cross 2 row with a 2 cross 1 column, and which is allowed according to the rules of matrix multiplication. So but the inner product will always give us 1 cross 1 scalar, or as just one number. Okay, then there are another some useful properties, or you can say some characteristics of the inner product, that for two orthogonal vectors v and w, ket v and ket w, if they're orthogonal, then the inner product is 0. So you can see an example. Let's say v is this, represented by this, and W is represented by this. Then our VW will be this. So actually, usually this is like a check that if you want to check that two kits V and W are orthogonal, then you calculate the inner product, and if it's 0, then we know that they're orthogonal. Like, and especially if there are a lot of components involved, with weird looking numbers in the entries, then this is a check for orthogonality. And the third property is that the inner product of W is actually the complex conjugate of V with W. And let's just calculate this, see how this is true, why this is true. Like in the general case, you guys can calculate for n components, but I'll just do it for the 2-component case. So W with V would be and see that this is just the complex conjugate of the above expression, this. Because if you take, for example, if you take the complex conjugate of this, then you will get, and according to the rules of complex conjugate, you take it for the sum, you take it, component wise, and then for the product, you just take the transpose of the element separately. So as I'll show here. So W1 star, and then another star will just give us W1 back, and similarly W2 star will give us W2 back, and V2 star. So we see that this is the same as what we had earlier. So yeah, and maybe you can try doing this in the n component case, or maybe you'll see some examples in the tutorial that the inner product of W with V is the complex conjugate of V with W. Okay. Now next, let's look at the norm of vector V. So that is defined as, so we write the norm as these two vertical bars around V, like any with the vector in middle. So this is just the symbol, and then we define it as the square root of the inner product of the vector V with itself, as shown here. So if ket V is represented using this, then the inner product of V with V itself would be this thing. So and recall that we use the property, that ZZ star is equal to mod of Z square. So we will get V1 star V1, which will give us mod of V1 square, and similarly mod of V2 square. And note that this thing will be always positive. So it makes sense to take the square root of something positive, because in the end we don't, the norm should not be a complex number. So it cannot have a real and imaginary part. It should be always be real and positive, because it it gives an idea of the length of the vector. So yeah. So, and as we can see as well that the mod square will give us a positive number, so the norm will always be the square root of some positive number as shown. Let's take an example. Let's say the ket V is given by this column. So using this column of 2n minus I. So you can straight away write the norm as this. So 4 plus 1. Because we'll just take the square of the imaginary part, which is -1. So -1 square times 1. And here this is just the real part, so 2 square is 4. So the norm is √5. Another note here is that we can normalize a vector V by dividing it by its own norm. And then this normalization is done, very frequently in quantum mechanics, like especially if you, because we talk about normalized vectors, normalized wave functions, and what it mean, what is meant by a normalized wave function will become clear to you in the next lecture, or maybe the lecture tomorrow on Schrodinger equation. But for the moment, let's just say that the process of normalizing a vector v just involves scaling it by this the norm of v, because the norm of this thing will always be 1. So that is what we mean by normalized vector, that the norm should be 1. And you can actually check that this thing will always have a norm 1. Yeah, maybe you'll see it in the slide of the tutorials. Okay. Next, let's look at the linear combination of vectors. So actually, yeah, I mean, I also hinted at this earlier, but okay, let's quickly look at it again. That a vector W, get W is said to be a linear combination of the set V1. So this is a set of vectors now. Now don't confuse it with the V1, V2 to be the elements of some vector. Here V1, V2 up till Vn, they are different vectors in our set. And the vector W is said to be a linear combination if there exist scalars C1, C2 up till Cn, such that we can decompose this get W as a linear combination of the set of vectors V1 till Vn. So as shown. Next, let's talk about the linear independence. So a set of vectors V1, V2 till Vn is linearly independent if every vector in the set cannot be written as a linear combination of all the other vectors. So, if like it should be the case that every vector, like you choose any vector, let's say you choose V5 from this set, and if that, or any random vector, if it cannot be written as a linear combination of the other vectors, then we say that our set of vectors is linearly independent, and this will be helpful in constructing a basis later on, or defining a basis later on. So in the next slide itself. So let's look at an example first. Let's say there is a set of 3 vectors here, represented by this column 3, 5, 1, 0, and 0, I. But we clearly see that this is not a linearly independent set, because we can write 3, 5 as this 3 times 1, 0. So these scalars can be anything in the set of complex numbers, plus minus I times, or minus 5 I times, minus 5 I times 0 I, because it will give us 5 I times I, 5 I squared plus 5. So this will, yeah. So we see that we were able to write 3, 5 as a linear combination of 1, 0 and 0 I. So this is not linearly independent. Example 1 is not linearly independent. But the example 2, it is linearly independent. Because no matter what you do with 1, 0, no matter what scalar you multiply with 1, 0, you can never create 0 I, because I, this I exists in a different dimension compared to this one. So you cannot never create a component which is non-zero from a component which is 0. So this set of 2 vectors is linearly independent. Okay. Now let's talk about a basis. So a basis is a set of n linearly independent vectors, that form n linearly independent vectors in Cn. So in Cn, because we want them to kind of span the space. So what I mean by that is that each of V1 should have n components. we call them by, let's say, v11, v12 till v1n, and this is true for every v in the set, that we have vi1, vi2 till vin. So each vector has n components, and then this set has n linearly independent vectors. So it has to form a basis, because in any in any dimension d, you can have at most d linearly independent vectors. Yeah. So actually, this statement will become more clear to you after the exercises in the tutorials. Yeah. But for the moment, let's just define the basis as this: that the set of n linearly independent vectors in Cn. Okay. Next, let's take an example. Yeah, and again, here we can clarify the point regarding the representation and the equality. So, till now we have been representing these kets, using a column of numbers. And why did we say that this ket is actually equal to this AB? Because this representation column, the column representation actually depends on the basis, as shown here. So, let's say there is a vector with this representation AB in this basis, basis 1. Sorry. Yeah. So we see that in this basis, V is A times E1 and B times E2. So, so the representation is just a shorthand notation for writing that, this has the representation AB in this basis. But the same vector V, if represented in a different basis, which is this E3, E4, will become this. So here, look at that, you notice that this is the same ket V, and now the constants or the scalars multiplying the basis elements have changed. So they have become a plus b by 2 and a minus b by 2, because E3 and E4 2. So in this new basis, our representation has changed, which is now become a plus b over 2 and a minus b over 2. So see that these scalars are the one that form the elements of the column. So yeah, so that this helps in understanding why a representation using a column is not the same as the vector, is not equal to the vector v, because the vector remains the same. It's just the representation or the numbers in the columns change. So that's why we have been using this representation symbol so far, which we'll continue to use. Okay. So having defined the basis, next, this is just a small addition on that. That what is the orthonormal basis? That if the elements in a set of linearly independent vectors, if they are normalized and also orthogonal to each other, so then we call it an orthonormal basis. So each of v1, v2, v3, each of is equal to 1, or the norm of each vector is 1, up till Vn, and then every vector is orthogonal to every other vector. Sorry. So so a compact notation for saying the same thing is this: that the inner product Vi Vj is equal to del Ij, which is this is the Kronecker delta symbol. And what that this is a symbol, this is a jargon. What that means is that if I is equal to j, then this inner product is equal to 1, and if I is not equal to j, then this is equal to 0. So which is the same as what I've written here, just a different notation. And an example of an orthonormal basis is shown here. That 1 0, if you calculate the norm, is 1. Same with is also 1, and then they are perpendicular to each other. So the norm of both the elements in the basis is 1, and but the elements are but the inner product is 0 of the two elements, so they are orthogonal. So they form an orthogonal basis. Okay. Next, we move to matrices. So matrix is just a box of numbers, or it's represented by a box of numbers. You should not say it is a box of numbers. So the same distinction also applies here. That so same distinction applies here, that a box of numbers represents a matrix, but it is not equal to the matrix. And a matrix maps vectors to vectors. That means, a matrix M, we can multiply that to a ket V or a vector B, and it will give you another vector. So, it should map vectors to vectors and not, I mean, you should not obtain another matrix by multiplying a matrix to a vector. That's what it saying is. So we can take an example. Let's say there is a ket V represented by this column XY. And what happens if we add this, or we multiply this matrix M represented by ABCD to the vector represented by XY. So we will follow the rules of matrix multiplication, or a multiplication of a matrix with a vector. So I hope that you already know this, that how to multiply a matrix with a column. So this is how you get the new column. So this is multiplied with this. You add this with this multiplied by this. So you in the first element you get ax plus by, and similarly you get cx plus dy. So this is the new column that you obtain. Okay. So this was a particular example of a 2 by 2 square matrix multiplying a 2 cross 1 column vector. But in general, if the matrix has n rows and m columns, so n rows and m columns, so that can act only on a matrix, on a vector which has m rows, because you see that this index has to be same. So we will map it, or we will act it on a vector in Cm, because it has m components, and it will give us a new vector in Cn, because then the product will have which will be another vector, but will have n components. Yeah. Next, let's look at some example of some special matrices. So one very important matrix type that you will see a lot in the lectures is a unitary matrix. So what is a unitary matrix? We define it as a matrix such that if you act it on a vector space, then the inner products of any two vectors in the vector space should not change. So for example, let's say there are vectors v1 and v2 in some vector space. You act this matrix U on V1 and V2 to get V1 dash and V2 dash. Then the inner product of V1 dash with V2 dash should be equal to the inner product of V1 with V2. So if this condition is satisfied for all vectors V1 and V2, then we say that this matrix U is unitary. So a small remark here, that the unitary matrices preserve norm of a vector, and this is very easy to see because the V dash that you get by acting U on V is this, like U times V, and just like we just defined that the norm of V dash with V dash should be the same as the norm of V with V. This is by definition. So, since this is the norm, we see that the norm is not changed. Okay. Okay, let's look at an example of unitary matrices. So one very trivial example is the identity matrix, which does nothing to a vector. It just like maps the vector to the same vector. Like I times V is V. And we see that, so it obviously follows the rule of unitary matrices. So identity matrix is a unitary matrix. Okay, let's look at another example, which is this matrix U2, represented by 0, 1, like, off diagonal elements, which has like off diagonal elements 1 and a diagonal element 0. So what happens to, V1 and V2? So this is calculate. So V1 dashes are V1 dash is equal to U2 times V1. So that it will just like switch the order of the elements. So it becomes BA. Similarly, V2 dash will become DC. So it will switch the orders. And then let's calculate V1, the inner product of V1 dash with V2 dash. So this is just B star D plus A star C. And what would be the inner product of V1 with V2? That would be again same A star C plus B star D. So we see that the inner product was not changed. And this is like a general matrix, general columns A and B. So where A and B could and C and D could be any complex numbers. So in general, we have calculated that the inner product did not change after acting this matrix U2 on V1 and V2. So hence we can say that this matrix U2 is unitary. Okay. I think, and yeah, this is the end of the lecture. This is the last slide in the lecture. So which is the Kronecker product. So Kronecker product is an operation on vectors and as well as matrices. And the use of this operation is to construct bigger vectors from smaller vectors. And this is used in quantum mechanics when you need to construct the vector representing the bigger system from the vectors representing the subsystems of the bigger system. So let's say there are vectors V and W with the representations as shown, V1, V2, and W1, W2. So you want to calculate the Kronecker product of these two vectors. Yeah, and I think this will be like the next example that you will see of Kronecker product would be in the lecture on qubits, which is I think tomorrow. Like just the next lecture, the first lecture tomorrow, I think. So how you calculate the Kronecker product is this, as shown, that you take the first component V1 here and you treat it as a scalar and you multiply it with the vector W. And similarly, you take the second component W2, you treat it as a scalar and multiply it with the vector W. So you see that the number of components will grow exponentially. Like if there were n components here, and if there were n components here, yeah, and so in the resultant we would have had n times n components. So here we had 2 times 2 components. Sorry, no, the exponentially increase. So if there were n components here, and if there were n components in W2, then the resultant would have had n to the power n components. Yeah. Wait, am I making a mistake? Sorry. Yeah. There would be n times n components. Yeah. Right. N plus n. So in this example, since there are 2 components in V and 2 components in W, so in the Kronecker product, we will have 2 times 2 equal to 4 components as shown. So V1 W1, V1 W2. So this is the result of multiplying this V1 with the scale with the vector W and V2W1 and V2W2 is the result of multiplying V2 with the vector W. And it is not necessary for both of them to have the same number of components. You can also have different number of components in the two vectors and you can still calculate the Kronecker product. So, if for example, if they are V1, V2, Kronecker with W1, W2, W3, then the number of the elements would be 2 and 3 here. So it will have 2 times 3 equal to 6. The Kronecker product will have 6 components, uh, shown as this. So you multiply this V1 with all the components of W1. So W. So V1 W1, V1 W2, V1 W3, and similarly for V2. W3. Yep. So it will, as shown, it has 6 components. So this is an example, and you'll get a lot more practice in the tutorial session. Similarly, we can also calculate the Kronecker product of two matrices, and it is the same thing. We just have to extend this concept to matrices. So we treat this A as a scalar and multiply it with all the components of the matrix, the other matrix. So since this is 4 by 4, this is 4 by 4. So the Kronecker product would have how many? Sorry, this is 2 by 2. Sorry. So this is 2 by 2. This is 2 by 2. So the Kronecker product would have 4 times 4 elements, 16 elements. Okay, so yeah. And maybe I should have more space here, but yeah. So what I'm doing is just this now. The kind of scalar multiplying A with every element of this second matrix. So that will give me AE, AF, AG, AH as shown here. Similarly, BE, BF, BG, BH, and then CE, CF, CG, CH, and then DE, DF, DG, DH. So this is the, so this is like, so this has like 4 rows and 4 columns. This is a 4 by 4 matrix that you get after taking the Kronecker product of two 2 by 2 matrices. So yeah, so you'll learn more about these, the utility of these operations in the lecture on qubits tomorrow. I think, yeah, this was the last slide in my lecture. And if there are any questions,